Rancher found a native girl beaten for fleeing marriage. Next day, she asked to be his instead. The blood on her torn dress told only half the story. Garrett Holloway pulled his Mari to a halt beside the creek where willow branches swept low over the water like mourning veils. What he saw there would change everything he thought he knew about courage, about justice, and about the kind of man he wanted to be. She was crumpled against the muddy bank, her long black hair tangled with leaves and dirt. Her buckskin dress, once carefully beaded in patterns that spoke of skilled hands and patient hours, now hung in tatters. Dark bruises bloomed across her copper skin like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. She could not have been more than 20 years old, but it was her eyes that stopped him cold. Even through the pain and exhaustion, they burned with a defiance that had not been broken. Those eyes met his without flinching, without pleading. They simply waited. Garrett dismounted slowly, his spurs catching briefly in the stirrup. 20 years of ranching in Wyoming territory had taught him to read danger in the set of a horse's ears, in the way cattle bunched before a storm, in the quality of silence that preceded trouble. This silence felt different. It felt like the moment before lightning strikes, when the very air holds its breath. The creek bubbled past them both, indifferent to human suffering. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song. The late afternoon sun slanted through the cottonwoods, painting everything in gold and shadow. It was the kind of peaceful scene that belonged on a Sunday after church, not wrapped around whatever violence had happened here. She watched him approach with the stillness of a deer that has decided whether to bolt or fight. Her breathing was careful, controlled despite what must have been considerable pain. One arm was cradled against her ribs. Blood had dried in a thin line from the corner of her mouth. Garrett stopped 3 feet away, close enough to help, far enough to avoid spooking her further. In his 30 years, most of them spent in the company of horses and cattle rather than people, he had learned that sometimes the greatest kindness was knowing when to give something wounded space to breathe. She spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper, but steady as bedrock. The words came in her native tongue, musical syllables that rose and fell like water over stones. Then, seeing his confusion, she switched to careful English. "You will help me or you will not, but do not stand there pitying me." The words hit him like a slap. Not because they were unkind, but because they were true. He had been pitying her, looking at her the way men looked at injured animals, calculating whether the kindness of help was worth the trouble it might bring. "I will help you," he said simply. Something shifted in her expression. Not relief exactly, but recognition. As if she had been testing him and he had passed, barely. Garrett shrugged off his duster and held it out. She studied it for a moment, then nodded. He draped it carefully around her shoulders, noting how she did not flinch from his proximity, but remained alert to every movement. Whatever had happened to her, trust was now a luxury she could not afford. "Can you ride?" She nodded again, though he could see the effort it cost her to straighten her spine. Pride was keeping her upright now, nothing more. "My place is 2 miles west. You can rest there, get cleaned up. Then we will figure out what comes next." "What comes next?" she repeated, as if the phrase were foreign to her. "Yes, I suppose we will." He helped her onto his horse, his touch as impersonal as he could make it. She settled into the saddle with the fluid grace of someone who had been riding since childhood, despite her injuries. Her hands, he noticed, were small but strong, working hands, hands that knew useful things. As they rode west toward his ranch, Garrett found himself stealing glances at her profile. She rode with her back straight, her eyes scanning the landscape with the automatic vigilance of someone who had learned that danger could emerge from any shadow. The wind caught strands of her hair, lifting them like dark silk against the pale canvas of his coat. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who understood that some things could not be rushed with words. But questions pressed at the edges of Garrett's mind like cattle pushing against a fence. Who was she really? What had driven her to that creek bank, beaten and alone? And why did looking at her make him feel like he was seeing something he had been searching for without knowing it? The Holloway Ranch spread across a valley that caught the morning sun like a cupped palm. Garrett had built it over 15 years of backbreaking work, starting with nothing but a handful of cattle and a stubborn refusal to quit when the winters tried to kill him. The house was modest but solid, built from local timber and river stone. The barn was larger than the house, which said everything about his priorities. As they approached the main corral, his foreman Miguel looked up from the fence he was mending. Miguel Hernandez had worked for Garrett for 8 years. Ever since drifting north from Texas with stories he did not tell and skills that spoke for themselves. He was the only person Garrett trusted completely, which made him one of maybe 3 people in the territory who qualified for that distinction. Miguel's weathered face registered no surprise at the sight of his boss returning with an injured native woman. He simply set down his tools and walked over to take the horse's reins. This was Miguel's way. Accept what was, deal with what needed dealing with, save the questions for when they mattered. "She needs a place to rest," Garrett said by way of explanation. Miguel nodded. "Elena is in town, but there are clean sheets in the spare room. I will heat water for washing." Elena was Miguel's wife, a small, fierce woman who had appointed herself Garrett's unofficial housekeeper despite his protests that he could manage perfectly well on his own. Which was, as Elena frequently pointed out, obviously untrue based on the state of his kitchen and the fact that he had worn the same shirt 3 days running more than once. Garrett helped the woman down from his horse, noting how she tried to mask a sharp intake of breath as her feet touched the ground. Her left ankle was swollen beneath her moccasin, and there were scratches on her arms that suggested she had run through brush in the dark. "What is your name?" he asked as they walked slowly toward the house. She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. Then, "Ayana. Ayana." He repeated it carefully, wanting to get it right. The name felt important on his tongue, like something that should not be carelessly handled. "I am Garrett Holloway. This is my ranch." She looked around at the buildings, the corrals, the broad sweep of pasture where his cattle dotted the hillside like scattered coins. Her gaze was appraising, professional. She was seeing not just a ranch but a life built from nothing, measuring its worth in terms he suspected had little to do with money. "You built this alone?" she asked. "Mostly. Miguel helped with the barn. Few others came and went over the years. And now you are alone here." It was not quite a question. Garrett found himself wondering what she saw when she looked at him. A 30-year-old bachelor who talked more to his horses than to people. A man who had chosen isolation over the mésanges of human connection. Someone who found peace in the rhythm of seasons and the honest simplicity of caring for animals that wanted nothing from him but food and shelter. "I am alone here," he confirmed. They reached the front porch, and Ayana paused with one hand on the railing. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold that seemed to echo the warm tones of her skin. In the distance, a coyote sang to the emerging stars. "Why did you help me?" she asked. Garrett considered the question. The honest answer was complicated. Because leaving her there had been impossible. Because something in her eyes had demanded better of him than his usual practice of minding his own business. Because in 30 years of careful solitude, he had never met anyone who seemed to understand that strength and vulnerability were not opposites but partners in the same dance. Because it was the right thing to do, he said instead. She studied his face in the fading light. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded and allowed him to help her up the steps. Her weight against his arm was slight, but he could feel the tension in her muscles, the way she held herself ready to run despite her injuries. The house was simple but clean. A main room with a stone fireplace that Miguel had built with river rocks. A kitchen that smelled faintly of coffee and leather. 2 bedrooms and a washroom that Garrett had added 2 years earlier over Miguel's protests that it was an unnecessary luxury. The furniture was functional rather than decorative, built to last through hard winters and the casual abuse that came with ranch life. The spare room was small but comfortable, with a window that looked out over the pasture toward the mountains. Garrett had used it maybe 3 times in 8 years, for the occasional cattle buyer who needed a place to sleep before the long ride back to Denver or Cheyenne. Miguel appeared with a basin of warm water and clean towels. He had also brought a jar of salve that Elena made from wild herbs, something she swore could heal everything from rope burns to heartbreak. The salve smelled of sage and something else Garrett could never identify, something that reminded him of mountain meadows after rain. "I will leave you to tend your wounds," Garrett said. "There is food if you are hungry. Rest as long as you need." Ayanna sank carefully onto the edge of the bed, her composure finally showing cracks. She looked suddenly very young and very tired. The defiance was still there in her eyes, but it was banked now like coals under ash, waiting to flare again when needed. "Thank you," she said quietly. Garrett nodded and retreated to the kitchen, where he attempted to make himself useful by starting coffee and slicing bread that Elena had left wrapped in clean cloth. His hands shook slightly as he worked, though he could not say why. He had dealt with injured animals countless times, had even helped Miguel stitch up a nasty gash from barbed wire the previous summer. But something about Ayanna's quiet dignity in the face of whatever had been done to her affected him in ways he did not entirely understand. The coffee was bitter and the bread was stale, but he ate without tasting either. His mind kept circling back to the moment when she had looked up at him by the creek, the way her eyes had seemed to see straight through to places he usually kept carefully hidden. Most people looked at Garrett and saw a successful rancher, a man who had carved something substantial out of raw wilderness through stubborn determination. But she had looked at him and seen something else entirely, something that made him feel exposed and grateful at the same time. Miguel joined him after banking the fire for the night. They sat at the worn wooden table that served for meals and business alike, drinking coffee and listening to the small sounds of someone moving carefully in the next room. Water splashing in the basin, the soft rustle of fabric, the creak of floorboards under careful feet. "She is Shoshone," Miguel observed quietly. Garrett looked up. "You are sure?" "The beadwork on her dress. The way she carries herself. Elena taught me to notice such things." Miguel sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "There is a reservation 40 miles north of here, but she is not from there." "How do you know?" "Reservation women dress differently now. Government clothes, mostly. Her dress is traditional, made by someone who remembers the old ways, someone who still believes in them." They sat in silence for a while, both men aware that they were dancing around larger questions. Who had hurt her? Why? And what would happen when whoever was responsible came looking? Because someone would come looking. Women like Ayanna did not simply disappear without consequences. "There will be trouble," Miguel said finally, voicing what they were both thinking. "Maybe, not maybe. Certainly, a woman does not run from nothing. And she does not get beaten like that for small rebellions." Miguel's voice carried the weight of experience, of having seen what happened when cultures collided and individual lives got caught in between. She ran from something big, something that mattered enough to risk everything. Garrett knew Miguel was right. In his 8 years in the territory, he had learned to read the complex tensions between the scattered native bands, the growing number of white settlers, and the territorial government that claimed authority over both. It was a delicate balance at the best of times, maintained through a combination of mutual wariness and careful distance. A balance that could be shattered by something as simple as a white rancher offering shelter to a native woman fleeing from whatever fate her people had planned for her. But as he sat there listening to the soft sounds from the spare room, Garrett found he did not care about the complications. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. Tonight, there was simply an injured woman under his roof, and that was enough moral clarity to last until morning. The sounds from the spare room had gone quiet. Ayanna was probably asleep, finally allowing her body to rest after whatever ordeal had brought her to his creek bank. Garrett found himself hoping she would sleep deeply, without dreams of whatever had put those bruises on her skin and that particular quality of wariness in her eyes. "I am going to check the stock one more time," he told Miguel. Miguel nodded, understanding that his boss needed to move, to do something with the restless energy that had been building since they had ridden back from the creek. Physical work was Garrett's way of thinking through problems, the way he sorted complicated feelings into manageable pieces. Outside, the night was clear and cold. Stars scattered across the sky like spilled salt, so bright they seemed close enough to pluck. The mountains loomed black against the star field, their peaks touched with snow that would not melt until late spring. Somewhere an owl called, its voice hollow and haunting. The horses were settled for the night, their breath steaming in the cold air. Storm, the gray mare, lifted her head when Garrett approached her stall, nickering softly in greeting. He had raised her from a foal, bottle-feeding her when her mother had initially rejected her. Now she was his most reliable mount, steady in a crisis and smart enough to anticipate what he needed from her. "What do you think, girl?" he murmured, stroking her neck. "About our visitor." Storm nuzzled his shoulder, her whiskers tickling his neck. Horses were better judges of character than most people, and Storm had not shied away from Ayanna the way she sometimes did from strangers who made her nervous. That had to count for something. Garrett finished his rounds and walked back to the house, his boots crunching on frost-crisp grass. The spare room window glowed softly with lamplight. As he watched, a shadow moved across the curtains, and he realized Ayanna was not asleep after all. She was standing at the window, looking out at the night. He wondered what she was thinking, whether she was planning to run again, to disappear into the darkness the way she had appeared, whether she trusted him enough to stay until morning, or whether years of hard experience had taught her that safety was always temporary and trust was a luxury she could not afford. Inside, the house was quiet except for the soft tick of the clock on the mantelpiece and the settling sounds that old wood made as it cooled. Garrett banked the fire and checked the doors, habits ingrained by years of living on the edge of wilderness where carelessness could be fatal. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with frost painting the windows in delicate patterns that would vanish with the first touch of sunlight. Garrett woke before dawn, as he always did, his internal clock calibrated to the rhythm of ranch work that began with the sun and ended long after it set. He dressed quietly and padded to the kitchen in his stocking feet, not wanting to wake his guest. Ayanna was already there. She stood at the window looking out at the pasture where his horses moved like shadows in the pre-dawn light. She had braided her hair and cleaned the worst of the dirt from her face, though the bruises stood out starkly against her skin like dark flowers. She wore one of his shirts over her damaged dress, the sleeves rolled up to accommodate the difference in their sizes. The shirt hung nearly to her knees, making her look even smaller than she was. "Good morning," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned, and he was struck again by the directness of her gaze. There was no false modesty in her examination of him, no pretense that she had not been studying his movements since he entered the room. She was taking his measure the way a careful person took the measure of a horse they were thinking about buying, looking for signs of temperament and reliability that would matter in the long term. "Good morning. I hope you do not mind that I used your kitchen." He looked around and saw that she had not just used it, but had somehow transformed it. Coffee was ready, eggs were scrambled and keeping warm in the pan, and bread was toasted to exactly the right shade of golden brown. The simple act of preparing breakfast had somehow made his kitchen look more like a home and less like a place where a solitary man grabbed fuel between chores. "I do not mind," he said. "Thank you." They ate in companionable silence, watching the sun paint the eastern hills in shades of rose and gold. The coffee was better than any he had made in 15 years of trying. The eggs were perfectly seasoned with herbs he recognized but could not name, flavors that reminded him of wild places and careful knowledge passed down through generations. "You cook well," he observed. "I was taught by women who believed that feeding people properly was a form of prayer." There was something in the way she said it that suggested those women were no longer part of her life, that the teachings she carried were all that remained of something larger that had been lost. They said that when you put love into food, people can taste it. When you put anger or sadness, they taste that too. "What did you put in this?" Garrett asked, taking another bite of eggs that somehow tasted like comfort and hope mixed together. Ayanna considered the question seriously. "Gratitude," she said finally, "and a little bit of wondering what happens next." After breakfast, they walked to the barn so he could check on his horses. Ayanna moved more easily this morning, though she still favored her left ankle and held herself with the careful precision of someone managing pain. She watched him work with the same focused attention she had given everything else, as if she were trying to understand not just what he was doing, but why he chose to do it this particular way. "How many horses do you keep?" she asked. 12 saddle horses, 4 draft horses for heavy work. The mares are all bred to foal this spring." He gestured toward a bay mare who was showing the subtle signs of pregnancy. "That is Willow. She is due any day now." Ayanna moved to the nearest stall, where a gray mare regarded her with curious eyes. She extended her hand palm up, letting the mare catch her scent before reaching out to stroke the velvet nose. The mare leaned into her touch, clearly enjoying the attention. "She is beautiful," Ayanna said. "What do you call her?" "Storm. She was born during the worst blizzard I have ever seen. We almost lost her and her mother both, but they pulled through." Garrett found himself smiling at the memory. "She was the stubbornest foal I ever saw. Refused to give up even when everything was against her." "Storm," Ayanna repeated, and the mare's ears pricked forward at the sound. "She likes her name. She likes anyone who talks to her with respect. Animals know the difference between people who see them and people who simply use them." Ayanna moved to the next stall, where a young gelding stretched his neck toward her with obvious hope for more attention. "My father taught me that. He said horses were gifts from the Creator, meant to carry us closer to the sky." Her voice carried a note of old sadness, the kind that came from loving someone who was no longer there to love back. Garrett recognized the tone because he had heard it in his own voice when he talked about his parents, both dead now for more than 10 years. "He sounds like a wise man." He was. He also said that a person's character could be read in how they treated animals that had no choice but to trust them. She looked at Garrett over the gelding's neck. "Your horses are not afraid of you. That says something." Before Garrett could ask what she meant, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. 3 riders were coming up the valley at a pace that suggested urgency rather than a social call. Even at a distance, Garrett could see that they rode with the purposeful formation of men who were tracking something specific. Ayanna went very still beside him. Her hand found his arm, fingers gripping with surprising strength. "I must tell you something before they reach us," she said urgently. "Yesterday I was to be married to a man I do not choose. When I refused, he beat me. When I still refused, others joined him. I ran in the night and they followed." Her voice was steady, but Garrett could feel the tension thrumming through her like a bowstring pulled taut. "But I am not a possession to be traded between men like a horse or a blanket." The riders were close enough now that Garrett could make out details. The lead rider was Sheriff Tom Morrison, a decent man who tried to keep peace in a territory where peace was always temporary and justice was whatever people could agree on in the moment. Morrison had been fair in his dealings with Garrett, neither favoring him for being white nor discriminating against him for keeping to himself. The other 2 riders were native men, probably in their 30s, wearing a mixture of traditional and white man's clothing. They sat their horses with the easy confidence of people born to the saddle, but their faces were grim. One wore a vest decorated with elaborate beadwork that caught the morning light like jewels. The other had braided feathers into his hair and carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "What do you want from me?" Garrett asked quietly, not taking his eyes off the approaching riders. Ayanna looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw something that made his chest tighten. Not desperation, not pleading, but a kind of fierce hope that took his breath away. It was the look of someone who had decided to bet everything on a single throw of the dice, who had chosen to trust in spite of every hard-learned lesson about the dangers of trust. "I want to choose my own life," she said. "And if you will have me, I choose you." The words hit him like a physical blow. Not because they were unexpected, some part of him had been waiting for them since the moment he found her by the creek, but because of what accepting them would mean for both of them. In a territory where tensions ran high and misunderstandings could turn deadly, taking a stand like this would put them both at risk. It would mark him as someone who interfered in native affairs, who thought white law should supersede tribal custom. It would mark her as a woman who had rejected her people's ways in favor of an outsider. But as Garrett looked into her eyes, he realized that none of that mattered as much as the simple fact that she was asking him to choose her back. After 30 years of careful solitude, of building walls between himself and the complications that came with caring too much about another person, someone was asking him to tear those walls down. The riders pulled to a halt in front of the barn. Sheriff Morrison dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose joints had seen too many years in the saddle. His face was weathered by sun and wind into something that resembled old leather, but his eyes were sharp and kind. He touched his hat brim in greeting. "Morning, Garrett," Morrison said. "We are looking for a young Shoshone woman, name of Ayanna. She ran off from her people 2 days ago, and there are some who are worried about her." One of the native men spoke then, his English careful but clear. "She is promised to my brother. The marriage was arranged by her family. She must come home?" The man with the beadwork vest stepped forward, his expression stern. "I am Joseph Standing Bear. This woman is my brother's intended bride. The bride price has been paid. The ceremonies have been prepared. She shamas her family and dishonors our agreement by running away like a child." Garrett felt Ayanna's grip tighten on his arm. He looked down at her, seeing in her face everything she had not yet told him about fear, about powerlessness, about the difference between survival and living. Her jaw was set with determination, but he could see the cost of that determination in the fine tremor that ran through her hands. When he looked back at the 3 men, his mind was clear. "Sheriff," he said calmly, "I would like you to meet my intended bride." The silence that followed was deafening. Sheriff Morrison's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline, while Joseph Standing Bear's face darkened like a thundercloud gathering strength. The 3rd man, who had not yet spoken, placed his hand on the knife at his belt with deliberate slowness. "That is not possible," Standing Bear said, his voice carrying the authority of someone unaccustomed to contradiction. "She is already promised. The agreements were made between our families when she was 16. 4 winters of preparation. The bride price of 20 horses has been delivered to her father." Ayanna stepped forward then, moving to stand beside Garrett rather than behind him. The gesture was small but unmistakable. She was not asking to be protected, but to be recognized as someone capable of speaking for herself. "I never agreed to those arrangements," she said, her voice clear and steady. "My father made promises without consulting me. Your brother accepted a bride who had never accepted him. A daughter's consent is not required when her father speaks for the family," Standing Bear replied coldly. "You bring shame on your people with this defiance. You will return with us now, and perhaps Thomas will still have you despite this foolishness." "Thomas," Ayanna repeated, and Garrett heard layers of meaning in the way she said the name. Fear, revulsion, and something deeper that spoke of wounds not yet healed. Thomas who beats women who displease him. Thomas who believes that paying horses makes him owner of a person. "I will not return to be his possession." The 3rd man finally spoke, his voice soft but carrying an edge that made Garrett's hand drift instinctively toward his own weapon. "You speak of shame, sister. But what shame is greater than abandoning your people for a white man? What honor is there in betraying everything our ancestors died to preserve?" "I betray nothing," Ayana said fiercely. "I claim the right every person should have, to choose who shares my life, who touches my body, who fathers my children. If that is betrayal, then I betray gladly." Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat uncomfortably. He was a man caught between competing systems of law and custom, trying to find a solution that would not end in bloodshed. In the territory, his authority was real but limited, dependent as much on the cooperation of the people he served as on any legal mandate from distant Denver. "Now, miss," Morrison said carefully, "these are serious accusations you are making. If this Thomas fellow has been mistreating you, that is a matter for the law to address. But running away like this, taking shelter with ... he gestured vaguely at Garrett. "Well, it complicates things considerable. What exactly are you saying, Sheriff?" Garrett asked, his voice deceptively mild. He had used that tone before, usually just before doing something that other people considered unwise, but that seemed perfectly reasonable to him. "I am saying that tribal law and territorial law do not always see eye to eye on matters like this. And when they conflict, well, it tends to be the folks caught in the middle who suffer for it." Standing Bear stepped closer, his bearing radiating barely controlled anger. "There is no conflict here. She is Shoshone. She belongs to the Shoshone. Your white man's law has no authority over our internal affairs, and yet she stands on my land," Garrett said quietly, "under my protection, asking for my help. That makes it my affair as well as yours." The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. 3 different systems of authority and belief had collided in his barnyard, each claiming precedence, each backed by the willingness of men to fight for what they saw as right. Garrett had seen such standoffs before, knew how quickly they could spiral into violence that left everyone diminished. But as he stood there with Ayana's hand still gripping his arm, feeling the slight tremor that ran through her despite her outward composure, Garrett found that he did not care about the larger implications. Sometimes a man had to choose between being wise and being right, between keeping the peace and protecting something that mattered more than peace. "Sheriff," he said, his voice carrying the same calm certainty he used when gentling a spooked horse, "I understand your position, but I want you to understand mine as well. This woman came to me injured and asking for help. She has told me that she does not wish to return to the marriage her family arranged. She has asked to stay here, under my protection, as my intended bride. I have accepted." Morrison rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "Garrett, you know I respect you. You have always been a good neighbor, never caused trouble for anyone. But this ... he shook his head. "This is the kind of thing that starts feuds, the kind that get people killed. Some things are worth the risk." Standing Bear's companion, the one who had spoken of betrayal, suddenly laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "Listen to him, Joseph. The white man speaks of risk as if he understands what is at stake here, as if he knows what it means to watch his people's ways die one piece at a time. My name is Marcus Swift Eagle." The man continued, his eyes fixed on Garrett with predatory intensity. "I am war chief of our band. I have fought the army, the cavalry, the railroad men who steal our land and poison our water. I have seen what happens when our people forget who they are, when they choose white ways over the wisdom of our ancestors." Swift Eagle's gaze shifted to Ayana, and Garrett felt her stiffen beside him. "And I have seen what happens to those who betray their people for the promises of white men. The promises are always broken. The betrayers are left with nothing, belonging neither to the world they abandoned nor the world that will never truly accept them." "You speak of betrayal," Ayana said, her voice low but carrying clearly in the morning air. "But what of the betrayal of forcing a woman to marry a man who terrifies her? What of the betrayal of selling daughters like cattle? What of the betrayal of calling submission to brutality honor? The words hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, acrid and impossible to ignore. Swift Eagle's face darkened, but before he could respond, Standing Bear stepped forward. "Enough," he said sharply. "We did not come here to debate the wisdom of our ancestors with a runaway girl and her white protector. We came to bring her home." He looked directly at Garrett, his expression implacable. "You will release her to us now, or we will take her." Garrett felt something shift inside him, a settling of certainty that was both liberating and terrifying. All his life he had chosen the safe path, the careful path. He had built his ranch on the edges of conflict, far enough from town to avoid its complications, far enough from tribal lands to avoid those tensions as well. He had made himself into someone who could be relied upon to mind his own business, to cause no trouble for anyone. But sometimes a man discovered that minding his own business was no longer possible. Sometimes the trouble came to him, and he had to decide who he really was when everything he had built was at stake. "No," he said simply. The word fell into the silence like a stone into still water, sending ripples of consequence spreading outward in ways that could not be called back. Standing Bear's hand moved to his rifle, while Swift Eagle's fingers tightened on his knife handle. Sheriff Morrison stepped between them with the weary resignation of a man who had seen too many situations spiral beyond reason. "Now hold on, all of you," Morrison said firmly. "Nobody is taking anybody anywhere by force. Not on my watch." He looked around at the assembled men, his authority real despite his obvious reluctance to use it. "This is a legal matter now, which means it gets settled legal. Miss Ayanna, you are of age to make your own decisions about marriage under territorial law. If you say you do not wish to return with these men, then you do not have to. The territorial law has no authority over Shoshone marriage customs," Standing Bear protested. "Maybe not," Morrison acknowledged, "but it has authority over what happens on territorial land. And right now, all of us are standing on territorial land." He adjusted his hat, a gesture that somehow managed to underscore his authority without appearing threatening. "Which means everyone keeps their weapons holstered and their voices civil while we work this out." Swift Eagle spoke again, his voice deadly quiet. "And what happens when you ride away, Sheriff? What happens when this white rancher is alone with his stolen bride? Do you think we will simply forget what has been taken from us?" The threat was unmistakable, hanging in the air like the scent of distant wildfire. Garrett felt Ayanna's grip on his arm tighten, but when he looked down at her, he saw no fear in her eyes, only determination, and something else that made his chest tighten with emotions he was not prepared to name. "Then I guess," Garrett said quietly, "we will all find out what kind of men we really are." The standoff stretched like a wire pulled to its breaking point. 6 people stood in the morning sunlight, each one a single wrong word away from violence that would reshape all their lives. The horses sensed the tension, shifting restlessly and laying their ears back with the instinctive knowledge that their humans were preparing for something dangerous. Sheriff Morrison looked from face to face, calculating odds and outcomes with the practiced eye of a man who had survived 8 years of keeping peace in a territory where peace was always fragile. His weathered hands hung loose at his sides, but Garrett noticed how his coat was unbuttoned, giving him quick access to his sidearm. "Here is what we are going to do," Morrison said finally, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to command through reason rather than force. "Miss Ayanna, you're going to tell me in your own words what happened to you and why you ran. No interruptions from anyone." Standing Bear started to object, but Morrison held up a warning hand. "I said no interruptions. Everyone gets their say, but they get it in order." He looked directly at Ayanna. "Go ahead, miss." Ayanna straightened, and Garrett felt something shift in her posture. She was no longer the injured woman he had found by the creek, no longer someone seeking protection. She was a person demanding to be heard, to have her truth acknowledged by men who would rather pretend she had no voice at all. "My name is Ayanna Bearwoman," she said clearly. "I am 20 years old. When I was 16, my father promised me in marriage to Thomas Standing Bear without asking my consent. I was told that a good daughter accepts what her family chooses for her. For 4 years, I tried to be a good daughter. Her voice remained steady, but Garrett could see the cost of each word in the set of her shoulders, the careful control of her breathing. These were not easy memories to speak aloud, especially before men who might use them against her. Thomas came to visit our camp many times during those 4 years. Each time, he showed me who he truly was. He struck me for speaking to other young men. He told me that after our marriage, I would learn proper submission. When I objected to his treatment, my father said that a husband has the right to discipline his wife as he sees fit. Standing Bear's face had gone rigid, but he remained silent under Morrison's watchful gaze. 3 days ago, the final preparations for our wedding began. That night, Thomas came to my family's lodge. He said that since I would be his wife within days, he had the right to claim what was already his. Ayana's voice wavered for the first time, but she pressed on. When I refused him, he struck me. When I cried out, he struck me again. He said that I needed to learn my place before our wedding, so that I would not embarrass him before the other families. The silence that followed was profound. Even the horses had gone still, as if sensing that something momentous was being spoken in their presence. I fought him, Ayana continued, her voice growing stronger. I am my father's daughter, and he taught me that courage is not the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear. I fought until Thomas grew tired of playing with me. Then he left, promising to finish teaching me obedience after our wedding ceremony. She turned to look directly at Standing Bear, her gaze unflinching. Your brother did not want a wife. He wanted a possession that would fear him enough to never challenge his will. I decided that night that I would rather die in the wilderness than live as his property. Standing Bear finally spoke, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. You twist the truth to serve your rebellion. Thomas is a good man, a respected warrior. If he was firm with you, it was because you needed firmness. A wife who does not respect her husband brings dishonor to both families. And what honor is there, Ayana shot back, in beating a woman who cannot fight back? What respect does such a man deserve? Enough, Swift Eagle said sharply. This is exactly why our people are weakening. Too much talk, too much questioning of the ways that have served us for generations. A woman who will not submit to her husband will not submit to anything. She becomes a poison that spreads through the entire community. Morrison held up his hand again. Mr. Swift Eagle, you will have your turn. But right now, I am still hearing from Miss Bear Woman. He nodded to Ayana. Continue. There is little more to tell. I ran that night, taking only what I could carry. They followed me, caught me before dawn. Thomas beat me again, worse this time. He said that when we returned to camp, he would publicly claim me as his wife, and that anyone who questioned his right to discipline me would answer to him personally. She gestured to her bruised face, her torn dress. I escaped again during the night. I ran until I could run no more. When this man found me by the creek, I was prepared to die rather than return. Instead, he offered me kindness without asking for anything in return. He offered me choice. Standing Bear could contain himself no longer. Choice, he spat. You speak of choice as if it were sacred. But choice without wisdom is destruction. Choice without respect for tradition is chaos. Our ancestors did not survive the winter hunts and the cavalry raids and the disease that came with the white man by making individual choices. They survived by putting the good of the people above their personal desires. And yet, Ayana replied calmly, those same ancestors taught that every person has a spirit that belongs to the Creator, not to other people. They taught that true strength comes from harmony, not fear. What harmony is there in a marriage built on violence? Swift Eagle stepped forward, his patience clearly exhausted. You want to know what harmony looks like? It looks like people who remember their place, who honor their obligations, who do not abandon their families for the first white man who offers them false promises. He turned his attention to Garrett, his dark eyes burning with contempt. And you, rancher, do you think you are saving her? Do you think your white civilization is better than ours? You know nothing of what you are destroying. This woman is not just a person. She is a link in a chain that stretches back to the beginning of our people. When she breaks that chain, something dies that can never be replaced. Garrett felt the weight of every word. This was not just about one woman's right to choose her own husband. It was about the collision of two worlds, two ways of understanding what it meant to be human in relationship to family, tradition, and personal freedom. I think, Garrett said carefully, that no one should be forced to live in fear. I think that love cannot be commanded or bought with horses. And I think that any tradition that survives by breaking the spirits of its people is already dead, whether anyone admits it or not. The words hit Swift Eagle like a physical blow. His hand moved to his knife, and for a heartbeat the morning balanced on the edge of violence. But Sheriff Morrison was already moving, his own weapon clearing leather with practiced smoothness. That is enough, Morrison said firmly. Everyone stepped back. Now. The moment stretched, then broke as Swift Eagle deliberately relaxed his grip on his knife. But his eyes never left Garrett's face, and the promise of future reckoning was clear in his expression. This is not over, Swift Eagle said quietly. You think your white law protects you, but law is only as strong as the men who enforce it. And Sheriff Morrison will not always be here to stand between you and the consequences of your choices. Morrison's jaw tightened. Are you threatening a citizen of this territory, Mr. Swift Eagle? I am stating a fact. This man has involved himself in affairs that do not concern him. He has interfered with tribal law and custom. There will be consequences, whether the sheriff's office recognizes them or not. The consequences, Morrison said evenly, will be whatever the law determines they should be. And the law says that Miss Bear Woman has the right to refuse a marriage she does not want, and Mr. Holloway has the right to offer her protection. Standing Bear shook his head in disgust. Your law is not our law. This matter will be settled according to Shoshone custom in Shoshone territory between Shoshone people. Not if it involves violence against territorial citizens, Morrison replied. And as of this moment, Miss Bear Woman is under the protection of territorial law. She is Shoshone, Standing Bear insisted. She cannot simply decide to stop being Shoshone because it suits her purpose. No, Ayanna said softly, and all eyes turned back to her. I cannot stop being Shoshone. It is in my blood, in my bones, in the way I see the world. But being Shoshone does not mean I must accept cruelty as my fate. Our people were not always this way. Once, women had voices in the councils. Once, marriages were made with consent, not force. Once, Swift Eagle said bitterly, we were strong. Once, we controlled our destiny. Now we bargain with white sheriffs for the right to govern our own families. And whose fault is that? Ayanna asked, her voice carrying an edge that cut through the morning air like a blade. Is it the fault of women who refuse to be beaten? Or is it the fault of men who chose pride over adaptation, who would rather break their people than bend with changing times? The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke. Swift Eagle's face went white with rage, and Standing Bear took a step forward that Morrison quickly blocked with an outstretched arm. That is enough, the sheriff said sharply. This conversation is going in circles, and it is getting more heated by the minute. Here is how this is going to end. Miss Bear Woman has stated her intentions clearly. She does not wish to return with you gentlemen. Under territorial law, she has that right. However, Morrison continued, his gaze shifting to Garrett and Ayanna, I strongly advise both of you to consider the consequences of your choices very carefully. This territory is barely civilized on its best days. When different groups of people get their backs up over matters of honor and custom, well, it tends to get ugly fast. He mounted his horse with the fluid motion of a man who had spent more years in the saddle than on foot. Mr. Standing Bear, Mr. Swift Eagle, I trust you will respect territorial law and not attempt to resolve this matter through force." "We understand your law, Sheriff," Standing Bear said formally, "but you must understand ours as well. This matter is not closed." Morrison nodded grimly. "I figured as much. Just remember that I will be keeping a close eye on things hereabouts. Any violence against territorial citizens will be met with the full force of the law." Sheriff touched his hat brim to Ayanna and Garrett, then spurred his horse toward town. The sound of hoofbeats faded gradually, leaving the four remaining people standing in a silence that felt heavier than the previous tension. Swift Eagle was the first to move. He swung onto his horse with angry efficiency, his movements sharp with barely contained violence. Standing Bear followed more slowly, his face a mask of cold fury. "This is not finished," Standing Bear said, his voice carrying across the distance between them like a threat whispered in the dark. "You have chosen to dishonor agreements made in good faith, to steal what was promised to my family. Such choices have consequences." "I have stolen nothing," Garrett replied calmly. "A person cannot be stolen because a person is not property." Standing Bear's smile was thin and cold. "We will see what you think about property rights when winter comes, rancher. We will see how much your white law protects you when you are alone in this valley with only your stolen bride and your noble principles to keep you warm." The two men rode away without looking back, their horses kicking up dust that hung in the still air like a cloud of unfinished business. Garrett and Ayanna stood watching until they disappeared over the ridge, both understanding that something irrevocable had just occurred. "Well," Garrett said finally, "I suppose that settles that." Ayanna turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. "Does it? You heard what they said about consequences. About winter. They will not simply accept this and move on with their lives." "No, they will not." Garrett met her gaze steadily. "Are you having second thoughts? Are you?" The question hung between them, honest and necessary. Garrett considered it seriously, weighing the comfortable solitude he was giving up against the unknown complications he was accepting. His life had been simple before this morning, predictable, safe. "No," he said finally. "No second thoughts." Something in Ayanna's expression softened. Not relief exactly, but a kind of settling, as if she had been holding her breath and could finally exhale. "Good," she said quietly, "because I meant what I said. I choose you, Garrett Holloway. I choose this life, this risk, this uncertainty. I choose it because it is mine to choose." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of revolution. In choosing him, she was choosing herself. In accepting her choice, he was choosing to become someone different than he had been an hour ago. They walked back toward the house together, neither speaking but both understanding that everything had changed. The sun was fully up now, painting the valley in shades of gold and green that made the whole world look like a promise waiting to be kept. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song, indifferent to human complications. There would be consequences to face, challenges to overcome, a future to build from the uncertain foundation of a choice made in defiance of expectations. But for now, there was simply the morning, and two people who had decided that love was worth the risk of everything they had known before. The rest would take care of itself, one day at a time.